Hebrew mythology is stated in a much different way. It has its stories, and it certainly has a lot of moral codes and laws and rites of ritual and things like that, but it's all written as history. It's often very difficult to determine what is history and what is allegory, and this is the thing that causes most people, like the fundamentalists especially, to miss the whole value of something like the Bible, because they're taking it all as history, and they're not at all looking at it as some kind of myth that has a moral within it. I'm not so sure that if they knew that, whether they would care much anyway. They might continue on as they do. It's written with the authoritarian certitude of history, and it puts great authority in the prophets, and it even says a lot of it is written by Jehovah himself. And so that everything that involves sacrifice or punishment for misbehavior or anything like that are stated as clearly as if it all came exactly from God. It's a very strange way compared to the story of the Greeks, where there was so much tolerance for almost any kind of lifestyle. All right. As you can see, I'm trying to dig into something new, and this is really hard to get going. There is enough, though, within the Hebrew mythology that is engaging, and if you've got a good curiosity, you can follow a lot of things. Zoroastrianism, for all of its clearly defined codes and rites, has almost existed not at all anymore. There are a few Parsis that took exile in India because they would have been exterminated if they had stayed in Iran. This was a few centuries back when religious tolerance wasn't much better than it is now. And so for all of its concreteness, it hasn't existed, and it hasn't thrived the way Hebrew religion has with all of its concreteness. So concreteness is not necessarily what causes a religion to endure. Greek mythology existed only in stories, and none of the religion is there, but because it's in stories and because it is so abstract and so fanciful, it probably affects more of us than any of the other mythologies, because it's just so prevalent in literature, in all forms of art, even in a lot of ideas and language used in medicine and science and quite a few other things. Christianity, since we're talking about religion, Christianity is different altogether. From its inception, Christianity was intended to be a first-hand experience. Since then, humans have done everything they can to divert from that, but they've put it into ritual, and they've put it into theological philosophy, and they've tried to water it down to insignificance. But from its beginning, unless you had the Pentecostal experience, the immediate experience, transcendental experience of the Holy Spirit, that is beyond concrete reason, you weren't really considered a Christian. If you read the Bible carefully, that was the definition of Christianity. Without that, you didn't have it. To this day, the Pentecostals are probably, among religious people, the probably only true Christians there are. Only quite a few of them seem to be faking it. I don't know. I don't want to be too harsh on people. But at any rate, Christianity has never really come into its own, or what was intended for it, for the very reason that the first principle, because it's very hard to try and live a spiritual life, especially now in a secular world. There's all kinds of materialistic detractions, technical distractions, anything to keep you from trying to focus inwardly and trying to carry these things into life. It is the hope that these lectures, or what we're trying to do by studying together and thinking about these things together, is that they lead to some kind of first-hand experience, or at least the inspiration to put in the effort to have the first-hand experience. And otherwise the talks aren't worth much. In our society, we have the hope of a real experiential religion, or a real experiential spirituality, because now human consciousness has gotten to the point that we have objectivity, and that objectivity is universal. If we have a scientific principle, or a mathematical formula, or a musical idea, that is something that is objective. We can understand the feel of the artistic experience, or we can understand the mathematical formula, and it's something that everyone can share. Everybody can participate in the proof of a theorem and that wonderful feeling of making the connection in an abstract way. Hopefully we can do the same thing in spirituality. Zoroastrianism is a dualistic outlook on life and reality. Zoroastrianism is, the term Zoroastrianism is a Anglicization That's an Anglicization. It's the religion of the Zarathustra. Who was the original founder of Zoroastrianism, and most scholars now use the Anglicization to talk of the religion and of the prophet or of the lines of prophets that had the same name. They use the original pronunciation or the original word. Being a dualistic religion, a lot of it is found in reaction. And the religion itself was based or began in reaction to internal and to external conditions. And that's what we're going to spend the whole rest of the night on. We're not going to talk about Zoroastrianism or anything else of that order. We're going to talk about some of the spiritual psychology of dualism, especially the inner-outer kind of dualism and the psychological, psycho-spiritual principle on which it's based. We'll look at some ideas that we've looked at before, but we'll try to look at them a little bit more deeply and carry them out a little bit better. When there is, I don't know how to say it, there are parallels in individual psychology and mass psychology. I become fascinated by this because I read a lot of Carl Jung. In fact, I'm trying to work my way through the complete works of Carl Jung, which is a laborious task because he was an excellent thinker but a not very good writer. And sometimes you can read the same page over 10 times before you get what he's trying to say. And the more I read the psychology as it applies to individuals, perversely it comes up in my mind as to how it applies to groups, societies, whole nations, the principles of psychology. And I want to look at that. In an individual, when an individual is divided, and the division is not necessarily healthy, this is a form of dualism. It's a form of dualism that is split. It's what in common street terms is called a split personality, or in psychological naming, it's called schizophrenia. When someone has insecurity about their basic nature, whether they're worth anything at all, there is often a withdrawal from social intercourse. A person doesn't want to go into society because they feel inadequate before society, and so sometimes I work, for example, with a professor that has all of his life escaped social reality. He desires the company of a woman. You see young co-eds walking by and his eyes light up, but I don't think he's ever had a girlfriend in his life. And instead he's withdrawn into the physics laboratory and has developed an extremely split personality to the point where he's in a dangerous state. But what happens is a person withdraws from social interactions because they feel inept at them anyway. And what happens if a person is not self-honest and does not draw on something from within? If there is the normal human pride, which is the big problem in all cases of mental illness, it's a kind of egoism that closes us off from having a healthy flow of creativity or intuition or spirituality coming through us that would keep us healed. In fact, you might even say that humility is the opposite of insanity, because the more humble a person is, the more they are open to a healthy understanding and acceptance of the external world and all that entails, and for a constant flow from within so that there isn't some kind of internal stagnation. But what happens if a person withdraws from normal, healthy social intercourse and lies to themselves about their own inadequacies? They start projecting evil and darkness externally. Sometimes there is an attempt to cling to something spiritual within, but often the internal compensation is some kind of delusional fantasy. And this is what is obviously described as a paranoid schizophrenic. The person feels grossly inadequate, like I'm not worth anything, and so what they do is they say all of these people are against me and they want to get me. And when you think about it, that is a self-rationalization. Because if somebody wants to get you, that means you obviously have something worthwhile, and you don't have to admit to yourself that you are nothing special. And if you don't admit, and if you had the humility and acceptance to say that you aren't something special, you might proceed forward. This phenomenon happens in groups. And one very good case in the last few years of this phenomenon is David Koresh and the Branch Davidians. From the testimony of his own mother, David Koresh was a very good boy. In his youth, his mother claims that he would spend hours on his knees praying. And he prayed to be cleansed of sin and to be a decent human being. Now, that's a pretty remarkable human being. I don't know if you know of many people who are teenagers who will spend hours on their knees praying, but this is not an ordinary human being. He also had something in his youth of normal tendencies with regard to the external world. He wanted to be a rock star. He wanted to be a rock star until he died. Now, nothing is ever wasted or nothing is ever lost. So all of the praying that he did had its effect. And that effect was that he became somewhat charismatic. And you can see something that is not quite a syndrome. In fact, it could even be very healthy. If a person realizes that they're inadequate or that they're sinful or something like that, and that drives them to inward to prayer or some other form of inward communion where they can gain spiritual strength, there's a hope in that somebody can be healed. In his case, he just became charismatic, and that whole cycle was interrupted. The internal division was not only resolved, it increased, and the division in his soul increased. Eventually, what apparently happened is that he was drawn to other people with similar psychological makeup. People who were misfits. Most of us are. We don't fit into society very well. And misfits that had a similar religious and cultural background. And then something happened. A lot of those other people had not spent many hours for a number of years praying. And they didn't have the charisma that he had. And so they looked up to him. And now what happened was a problem that is a problem that keeps pool sharks in cash on a pretty steady basis. They believed he was a prophet. You see, if you're in the dark, or if you're more in the dark than someone else, or if you're less schooled or skilled at playing pool, you don't know how much better somebody is than you. In some cases, you don't even know that they are better than you. There's something about ignorance that doesn't allow you to relatively know how ignorant you are. And so all of these people, yeah, it's a tough thing. You know, in the case of pool sharks, what they actually do is they try to conceal the fact that they're much more skilled, and they make intentional blunders, or they make a lot of things look as if they happen by slop or luck or something like that, and so they get away with it for a long time. They can really clean you out. I got cleaned out once by a gin rummy shark. He had something like 160 IQ, and the guy counted every card that went down the deck, and boy, did I get cleaned out. It put me to work as a delivery boy in a drugstore to keep myself solvent. The people around him were self-doubting, and they had projected their own inadequacies in terms of concerns, in terms of a paranoia, a cultural paranoia that there's evil people out there. And so they likewise projected their source of salvation. And they could see, hey, this is a guy like us, but he's really got something. And they took him for a prophet. And it's a kind of a funny logic if the evil is out there, and then the healing of the evil must be outside also. Then we don't have to do anything about the inside, because that makes you a little uncomfortable to have to deal with the inside, especially if that's where most of your insecurity is in the first place. It sounds a lot like materia medica, doesn't it? Like the diseases happen outside, and the pills and the medicine come from outside, and our body just is a battleground, and we don't have to do anything about it. We don't have to take any part in our illness or our recovery. Of course, this produced a big dilemma for David Koresh. At first, his self-doubt, which was very keen, his personal unworthiness, led him to decline that he was a prophet. Now, this is a pretty honest thing to do. It's a healthy thing. It's being very genuine about it. However, people persisted, and their numbers grew, and he was part of this movement. and their enthusiasm and their acceptance of him, because if you're socially misfit and suddenly people are saying that you're something wonderful, you're not really accepted yet, but you're still set apart, but you're set apart as somebody special, as a prophet or something like that. And he fell for it. He accepted it, and he took all of their energies, and what they projected to him actually increased his charisma. This is a fairly common problem that you see all over. Anybody that is a performer, if you perform and you get before a large number of people, and the people love you, and you have a reasonable amount of talent, people start projecting things to you, and you feel very buoyed up and very uplifted, and you actually believe you're all of it, and you actually do things that you were never capable of doing before. Of course, when the performance is over, you sink back into the place where you have to recognize yourself again, except if you're in something like a cult where there's always somebody around and you don't have that opportunity afforded to you. But then you want to stay up, and you don't want to admit to yourself that you really are what you are. And this is why among all performers, even a lot of athletes, like you can really get up for a game or something like that, and like if you're in a football stadium and there's 60,000 people cheering, that's quite a powerful thing to have happen to you. And so his charisma waxed, and he became very strong. But the thing of it is, when he once lied to himself, and instead of taking his source of healing or his source of strength from within, even when praying for his inadequacies, when that was lost and he accepted it from without, he also lied to himself about the imperfect parts of himself, and he externalized them in a them against us kind of duality. And so there is in that psychology, there is a normal kind of dualism that comes out. And so both his paranoia, which now was collective, they're going to come and get us because we have the truth, and they don't want the truth. They want to stamp the truth out. The dark one wants to stamp the truth out. And he's now getting all of this energy from all of these people. So it is a collective phenomenon. And what happened is the enforcement agencies, being ordinary people, perhaps even superstitious and skeptical of something like psychology, they walked right into it. I'll tell you a little personal story. It's something that happened to me about 25 years ago. And it was something that happened in about 2 seconds' time, but it has marked my life ever since then. I used to be much more of a food faddist when I was younger, and I used to do a lot of fasting. And I was doing a grape juice fast, and a bunch of us were hanging out together. And late one night, I ran out of grape juice, and some of us went to where the Menards is now. That used to be a Koepsel food center or Koepsel department store, and it was open all night. And I went to get grape juice, and so we went there, and we didn't know where it was. So we all fanned out going through the grocery, and I was walking along down the main aisle, and I thought it was the correct side aisle to go down, and I turned around the corner, and when I did, there was this little man, maybe about 5'4" or something like that, and I would say probably in his 50s. And what he did is he went like this, like he was cringing, as if I was some sort of ogre or something like that, and that I was out to get him. And in a flash of a second, what happened is a really ferocity came out of me that was unnatural to me. I never did anything, but I just felt the whole wave of it. And I walked past him and I got the grape juice, and that's the end of it. And it took me a while of reflecting back to understand that I had walked into his syndrome. Like he himself had some kind of personal persecution notions. And he had this set up so much so that other people walked into it, and they walked right into his right into his fantasy. It happened just as quick as can be, and that's what happened with the Branch Davidians. They walked into this, and he said, "We got to clean those guys up." I think it was for them. It was all penis envy because they had more guns and they had completely automatic rifles and things like that, and they eventually had to appeal to the big penises in the forms of tanks and such like that. But it was that sort of thing. And this was then a self-fulfilling prophecy. Anytime we project a dream, whether it's a delusional dream or whether it is a creative activity where it is a living imagination, what happens is if we really do a good job at that and put some life into it, it does come to pass. All right. Now, we're not trying to say that Zoroastrianism or Zarathustra was paranoid. We're not trying to say that at all. Because obviously, in the greater destiny of things, all religions have their appointed purpose. They're there to serve people who have certain needs, to edify them and help them to move on. So we're not saying that it's, there are cults, as we've talked about just now, that are manifestations of collective psychological illness, but a world religion isn't really like that. The general testimony is that Zarathustra and Zoroastrianism were both very high religions. In fact, some people like Rudolf Steiner claims that two of the primary students of Zarathustra were later reborn as Moses and Hermes Trismegistus. Pretty high-class students to have. But note, we've just done something there. We have, in this statement from Rudolf Steiner, we have accepted something from the greater consciousness, and that's now that we know by the principle of pool sharks, we know that that is subject to question. In fact, after a while, you begin to believe that you can't state anything except from realized personal experience, and even then, not a lot. What we're trying to get at is that Zoroastrianism, even though it is not a delusional projection, because it is dualistic, utilizes the same psycho-spiritual principles that are active in a sick way in paranoia or something like that. That is, we're talking about the projection of an invisible internal dream in order to objectify it, to interact with it, to transform it, and to grow through it. Since we're mentioning somebody like Steiner anyway, the dualism, the internal-external dualism, Steiner states one of the crux principles of it really, really well. He says if you want to know about the external world, look inside yourself. If you want to know about yourself, you look in the external world. What someone sees in the external world is a reflection of what they are inwardly. And what is in the external world is a way that we can find out what is within us. But if we want to know what the external world means, we have to give of ourselves. You know what I'm saying? Like, it's sort of like you want to know how you think about something, like how you feel about labor unions. So you start writing about it. And when you start writing about something external, then you clarify and congeal your own convictions and you come to know what you are inwardly, whereas if you hadn't had some movement from without in or from within out, without that kind of reciprocal flow, there is no knowledge. It is through change and the awareness of change that we come to knowledge. So we're going to, next week or 2 weeks from now when we meet again, we're going to talk more about the historical roots of Zoroastrian dualism. But now I want to go just a little bit more into this psychospiritual principle because I think it is really very, very important. To do that, we'll follow the admonition of Platon. My Platonist friends are saying, no, you can't use Plato anymore. You've got to respect them, not give him, use his street name, and use his real name, which is Platon. When he, in the Republic, he talks about if we try to understand what justice is, we have the best chance of understanding it if we look at it in the big case. Because Plato was very much influenced by geometry, and he knew that a geometric construction stands a much greater chance of being accurate if it's done on a large scale, because then your tools are less likely to, their errors are less likely to show up. I can still remember the first geometry paper that I wrote. We were supposed to give a demonstration of a construction of parallel lines, you know, where you make a line and then you run an angle across it, and then a line across it. You measure this angle and you take some point and you reproduce that angle on there, and then you have produced parallel lines. And mine was so bad. It was a small-minded Einsteinian world because the parallel lines met before they got off the sheet of paper. What? Yeah. So, Platon goes on to say that there is more likely to be a purer truth in the macrocosm than in the microcosm. And so what we're going to do is we're going to take the biggest case that we can take, and that is the case of the Supreme Being relative to the unknown absolute. The potential of everything that is and isn't, and you can't go beyond that. You can't say anything about what is beyond words. It is not uncommon among people writing about the emergence of the Supreme Being from the Absolute or from silence to refer to it as a word. The Greeks, for example, called it logos. And the Gospel of St. John says very beautifully, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with the One, and the Word was the One. And we have the vibrations of that original Word being picked up by radio telescopes, not only in the concrete manifestations from it, but in the background radiation. And from the Orient, from India, we have that almost unpronounceable word with the 7 vowels in it that is nothing but the 7 vowels. I can't ever say it right, so I won't even take a try. But all agree that the word is an expression of an invisible and ever invisible meaning. And that the word, as it takes life, becomes light. And that light is out of which all things proceed. Pythagoras, when asked for a definition of God, said, you can't actually give a definition of God. The best that I can think of is that it would be a being whose body is light and whose soul is truth. That's a pretty good definition. The ancient Chinese, when talking about the primordial word behind everything, had a very interesting slant on it. The ancient Chinese felt that the original word was and is a laugh. not in the way that the existentialists would see it. The existentialists would love that because they see all of existence as some kind of cruel, absurd joke, and that to try and make sense out of it is silly. Other people have liked this notion for other reasons, but I like it for one particular reason, because it is consistent with one of the psychological theories for humor. According to, we laugh at something when we have our insecurity relieved. And it is that relief of the insecurity that makes us feel so good, and the sudden lifting off or relief of it, that we get that relaxing, bubbling type of quality that comes from laughter. This fits in, for example, with the Slavic manuscript, if you're familiar with it, the Slavic manuscript of the Essenes about the nature of Christ. It's one of those documents that is historically shady. Nobody knows whether to believe whether it's true or not. But it has some very lovely things to say. And it says, for example, about Christ Jesus, that he was known to weep frequently, but to never laugh. And it would mean that he probably had the smile, the Buddha-like smile, but he never laughed, probably because there were no insecurities to relieve. So we laugh when somebody who's trying to maintain dignity does something awkward. You know, I try to say profound things and then misspell God, or forget to turn the microphone on, or do something like that. And one of the subjects that we're all insecure about, or most of us are anyway, is the potent force that is given to us in terms of sexuality to be either used sexually or to be used mystically. And we're all rather uncertain about that. And so if somebody has a bit of wit about them, sexual humor can be tremendously funny. And we laugh because somebody else gets the apple pie in the face and not us. And usually we get the apple pie in the face or the cream pie in the face, and they aren't hurt. You know what I mean? Something, Wile E. Coyote drops an anvil or something like that from way up on top, and somebody gets smashed down, and they get up, and life goes on. Now, I'm not so blasphemous to say that the Supreme Being, the universal spirit of everything, is insecure like a neurotic, or like a simple human being under pressure from the spirit. But that doesn't mean that the principle isn't applicable. If we think about it relative to the absolute, which can be everything that is and everything that isn't and everything that could be, and you can't even talk about it. If there is a manifestation as great as the creation is that we know of, going as far as the Big Bang has it go, and that's only on the material plane, to say nothing of all of the other spiritual realms and all of the complexity and all of the sublimely beautiful things that are in existence, even that has its end. It has its limitation. And relative to all potential, there is, and what you might say, an infinite differential. And if the whole process of creation, the whole manifestation that we belong to, is a process of self-becoming and is a process of awakening to objective self-consciousness, part of that self-consciousness is a realization that there is a lot that isn't. And so there is something like an incompleteness or a curious uncertainty And you might describe that as something like an insecurity. I don't mean to say that the divine being is obsessive, like somebody who's obsessive about washing their hands and they have to create because they have to get rid of this obsession. But it's like there is an infinite could be that draws us on and on and on, but it's not in a neurotic way, but it's in an exceedingly joyous way. It is like the creation being done as it is done is just so wonderful that the ongoing is more like a celebration or more like a joy than it is something like an obsession. So, in what theosophy they call the great praliyas, when the Supreme Being sleeps in the Absolute, because it has no longer the will to sustain the objective process. I don't think necessarily sleep the way we sleep, but not unlike it. In that unconscious state, there is probably something similar, but not like exactly our dreaming. It always happens when we get excited about something, we discover something and we think, wow, would it be great to do that? And we set out on some new creative process. It never comes out the way we want it to, but we get so filled from the experience that when we do relax from it and we ponder over it and more or less are quiescent again and everything comes back in us, some new idea dawns on us and we're filled and the whole process starts all over again. This, of course, gets into a very difficult psychological question, which I'm not at all going to go into. I'll just mention it, but it's something that I think about a lot, and that is the nature of the unconscious and the conscious. Is there, between the Supreme Being and the Absolute, is that the ultimate flat case of the relationship between the conscious and the unconscious? For what I'm talking about in the relative case, like in ourselves, we can see that our consciousness is really small. It's something like a flashlight in a dark night. What we're aware of is very little. Or like a little fire in the middle of the woods. With that fire, we can see to get more firewood and make the fire bigger and see, until we have a forest fire going or something like that. But we realize that most of us is unconscious. That is subconscious and superconscious. We have all sorts of psychological syndromes and machinations and complexes and such going on inside of us that are based on the residue of our past unredeemed experiences. We have impressions and hang-ups and tendencies that are just below the consciousness. Plus we have a superconscious reality, which by meditation or by prayer or concentration or other spiritual exercises we're trying to wake to. Now the psychologists claim that we can never know the unconscious. And that's because very few of the psychologists have ever practiced the spiritual practices. In fact, it was anathema to a lot of them. But ultimately, when it comes to the ultimate flat case, is it like the psychologists say? When it comes to the Supreme Being and the Absolute, is it such that there is an unconsciousness that we can never know? I don't know. It's something that I ponder a lot. I tend to think it is like it is here, that by constantly working, we do expand our consciousness, and that that we can keep changing the frontier. there are differences between this look at dualism, internal and external, and David Koresh, and some of the Hindu stories that we've been looking at for the first few talks. Remember when we were talking about from the Brahmana, where Prajapati is doing what is not done, meaning to say, creating, should the whole creation ever be done? Because maybe the whole creation is itself a fantasy. It's really interesting the way the cosmic principles are repeated in even the littlest things. Carl Jung has a lot to say about the psychology of rumor. For example, he says that rumor often fills out the picture, rumor and gossip fill out the picture better than the story that is actually told. But it usually goes overboard and adds a lot of fantasy in at the same time. But in the psychology of rumor, Carl Jung does not mention that principles like the very one that we're talking about, the projection of a dream from within out, also applies, because the very thing that Prajapati was accused of doing in going from the one to the many, he is accused of incest. It's really interesting that all of the rumor probably planted by the federal agencies, I don't know, but David Koresh was accused of not outright incest, but pretty close to it, pedophilia and a whole bunch of things like that. And it really makes you wonder if the whole business, how clearly the archetypal idea from the cosmic oneness dividing within itself and then having the two halves of itself interact, and from that to having the whole creation take place, how that whole notion is carried out in rumor and gossip, and or in the case of David Koresh, it might have even been propaganda to cover up for the fact that they destroyed the people who never attacked anyone. They had all kinds of weapons, but there was never any hint of them even doing anything at all to interfere with anybody's civil liberties or to interfere with. They weren't even that big of proselytizers. And why should they be attacked the way that they were attacked? It's just but the same archetypal idea comes through. I'll pass. I don't know. I'm having a hard time staying on the thread of thought that I'm on now because I've opened too many things up, and the reality is that consciousness exists both in the manifest and the unmanifest. That consciousness is the one thing that is absolute. Whether it is waking consciousness, objective consciousness, subjective consciousness, pre-consciousness, they are all states of consciousness, and that is what bridges the gap. In comparison, the creation of the Supreme Being relative to the Absolute is called doing what is not done, but that we saw to be a very radical idea, as if to say that all manifestation, because it is imperfect, and the more manifest and the more concrete it becomes, the more obvious and evident the imperfections are, because it is a journeying into the unknown, and the unknown is just that, and in getting to know it, there are mistakes that are made. But the whole idea that the dream, living out the dream, that dream is itself a delusion or a fantasy or an illusion is, whether that is the case or not, it is the doing that brings the change in consciousness about. There clearly is a big difference between a healthy creative imagination where one conceives an idea and manifests it and expresses it and learns through it and grows through it. That's a big difference than projecting a fantasy, especially projecting a paranoid fantasy that they're against us. But the truth of the matter is that you learn the same both ways. Indeed, David Koresh was doing what is not done. And because what was projected and acted on was delusional and it was not a true, how would you say it, self-forgetting creative imagination and had tragic results. But he's no doubt going to learn from it because he did something. What is important is that one must step into the dream. That is, we must, from within, when we project a dream, we have to step into it and we have to live it out. If we don't, it's a fantasy. A fantasy is an imagination that is projected, that is never intended to be acted out, that is never intended to be completed. And that is why in the most withdrawn people, the more withdrawn they are, the more fantasies that they have with no attempt to ever live them out, and as a consequence, no growth from it. At this point, if we're aware of what goes on, we shudder when we think of the dream or when we think of the projected consciousness of somebody like David Koresh or all of the other tragic heroes who have projected things and then stepped into them and found out their delusions really were delusions. It's enough to make one very much shudder. We've talked all along this year about how all cosmogenical myths have at their heart puns of words and puns of principles. I want to bring that back again. Now, Blavatsky, when she's talking about the Eastern creative ideas with great wisdom, she says, in the end, all is naught but desire. She could very well have said that in the end, all is naught but, in the beginning, all is naught but desire. When you're talking about desire in this sense, you're not meaning about the desire for a lemon pie or a lust for power or a lust for sex or something like that. It is desire in the sense of the word want. Like this image wants completion. And this being, whether it is you or I or the Supreme Being, wants completion. It needs to be more complete, it needs to be more awake, and it needs to progress. And in order to do so, it needs to go beyond itself. And by self, we don't mean necessarily this self-conscious notion that we have, the idea that we have of selfhood, but just the whole reality itself. Meaning to say that the whole creation, as far as it extends inwardly and outwardly, is the self of the Supreme Being that the Supreme Being needs to get beyond. What? No. But potential is what it goes through to get there, but we have to get beyond what we are now. Self, in that sense, meaning what we are now. Now, the paradox in the pun is that for us to get beyond where we are now, we have to know what we are. In short, we have to wake up and remember what we are. But then the other side of the paradox is that once we know what we are, we have to forget that and go beyond it. Because otherwise, there's no progress, there's no growth, there's no life, and everything is insipid. Yes. Unless you go beyond what you are, life is nothing but insipidity. And you
going beyond require forgetting?
Yes. Not necessarily like forgetting, like I forgot what I had for breakfast, but not hanging on to the notion of this is what it is as it is now. Like for us, because we are ego-bound, when we become self-forgetting, we let go of that nature, that conception that we have of I am this or I am that, especially if we identify with this. We say I am an astrologer, or I am a mystic, or I am a physicist, or I am a chemist, or something of that order. We have that attitude of identity that isn't really us. But the same thing applies to the other identity of self, where this is all that is, and there can't be anything more as long as we accept that this is all that is. As long as we're hanging on to that acceptance, there can't be anything more. So there is a kind of an abandon or a kind of forgetting that is absolutely necessary to get beyond ourselves. And what I'm saying then is, whether we take it in the sense of egoism or in the sense of existential reality, which, if adhered to too much, allows us never to get beyond it, in either sense, we have to give it up. And so when we project a dream, whether it's a delusion or it is the dream of the creation that we are now living through, we have to play make-believe for keeps. And that is, we have to give of ourselves or give up ourselves and give to the dream so completely that we forget ourselves. Because the only way we can get beyond ourselves is to be stripped of self, to let go of it all, or to be stripped of ego. Because ultimately, there is too much friction, and there is, in a way, here the irony comes back again, there is too much illusion in assuming that the way it is only the way that it is or could be. And you just have to let go. However, when one is stripped of self, in the sense of ego, all of that dependency on ego is gone. And when one is stripped of, it's a nice thing to know that this is reality and see what's really there, but when you're stripped of the identification with it or the clinging to it as reality, there is a release and a freedom. An unprecedented or unknown freedom for us, for we who are too focused into all of this. And with that comes a joy. And clearly, that is what the cosmic laugh is. It is a kind of ecstasy that, yes, that was there, but there's something more. And it's, like there is no greater joy than the joy of humility, because you don't have the weight of anything on you. And there is no greater joy than to be relieved of the cosmic responsibility, existential cosmic responsibility to see what could be. And so there is a very great joy that is like a laugh. And so when the dream is lived out right in the moment, the beginning and the end is all right there in the moment. And so the whole expression of the dream that is lived out is like a laugh. All right, we've looked a little bit at some of the psychospiritual principles that are involved in the reactionism of dualism. We're going to look at it more next time from the historical perspective, and we might even look a little at tell some stories as a mythology class, and we'll continue along. We're going to look at a lot of different ideas of dualism. But just to repeat, the whole idea is that in the process of internalization, the very movement inward produces a polarity where there is an external projection. And that when the consciousness follows into the external projection and gives itself all to its creation, gives it, like in all of the mysteries, the whole principle of initiation where one gets beyond one's personal self into the divine nature. It's described in the early Rosicrucian things of the pelican diving into its own breast and chewing pieces of its heart to feed its babies. And for your own creation, you give everything that you have, including yourself, and then when you do that, you realize the dream. You step into it, you pass through it, and in that very process of giving yourself up to it, it gives itself up to you, and it dissolves within you, and of course, then you're back to sleep again. But that is the principle that is in a very ugly way manifest in something like a destructive cult, or in a very sad way in a destructive cult or in a paranoid personality. But ultimately, the same principle is manifest anywhere where there is an internal-external dualism. And next time we'll start looking at the way Zoroastrianism developed and what kind of religious and historical climate it developed for that kind of dualism. I don't know what you're saying.
Well, say you follow Jesus,
I think this happens all the time. I think in a healthy way. I think that's the way all initiation takes place. Because ultimately, initiation in modern times is like a little death. In order to get beyond the limitations of your personal existence so that you can exist in a wider sphere, you have to be willing to die for the truth. And you indeed, in your whole self-knowing process, you literally have to externalize everything that is in you. Yes, I do. If there is a lot of imagination about an individual, that happens because clearly things like this happen in everything from the Third Reich to somebody like a Jesus figure. That this is what it is for people who believe in working through masters. The principle is consciously worked in this way, that people externalize. It's called transference principle in psychology. Only in spiritual schools it's much more extensive. What is hidden within a person that they're trying to either heal or come and one with and manifest creatively gets projected on a master. And if the master is fully conscious of what is going on, the master feeds it back in such a way that a person comes to a clear realization of what they are. And when they see that, they will more or less transcend or float above or rise above what they were before. And yeah, but It's a very deadly thing, though, to put it onto a human being unless that human being really knows what they're doing. If a psychiatrist isn't really trained, then this is what happens. Suppose you're a middle-aged psychiatrist and some lovely young woman comes into you and starts projecting onto you, and you got to go home to your wife and kids and mortgage payment and all of that, and suddenly here's somebody looking at you in a way as a manifestation of God, and it's easy to see how psychiatrists get involved with their patients. It's one of the worst things you can do because this is a very sacred process. And I don't think it's wise. I think when we have overweening romantic fantasies and imaginations about members of the opposite sex, that destroys more male-female interactions than anything that I know of. And it's a very painful way to come to realization that you don't project the dream on an equal. You project the dream in a way that it can really be something creative. That's all the time. I think that I think that's the last vestige of unconscious clairvoyance in human beings is the projection of romantic fantasy, which straitjackets the object of that projection and keeps us from having anything real. And I think it's much better that we see somebody for what they are and love them and treat them kindly and learn from them and do things with them rather than saying, you're the ultimate or something like that. Good night.